Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute, and thrilled to be here, as I know all of you are. There's been a lot of buzz around waiting for today's EI Distinguished, Earth Institute Distinguished Lecture. It's the final one of the year, and we're ending the year in fabulous style with a most remarkable scholar and practitioner of sustainable development, Professor Jared Diamond. Probably it's true for almost everybody here. If Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse are not your two favorite books, I don't know what you're reading, but they ought to be, and they've had a huge effect on thinking all over the world. They are the kinds of studies and just representative of Professor Diamond's work that you read them and it changes your view of the world. It changes your view of the intellectual enterprise and your understanding of the earth, society, history, and a lot more. I was just saying to Professor Diamond as we were coming in that we're facing the challenge of the Earth Institute of bringing together 6 or 7 major disciplines and learning to talk to each other, and it's something he can appreciate because when he sits down to lunch alone, he's also bringing together 6 or 7 disciplines. He's a one-person Earth Institute and an inspiration for us, and also a member of our external advisory board, for which we are enormously grateful. Jared Diamond is now professor of geography at the University of California, and that's a wonderful thing because there's also a resurgence of geography as a core scientific field in this country, which, of course, Professor Diamond's work is helping to inspire. He was previously professor of physiology at UCLA School of Medicine, so there you have 2 of them, of these disciplines. He is, of course, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies, which also is a winner of the 1998 Rome Poulenc Science Book Prize. And, of course, we're here to hear about and also celebrate his recent book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. He's author of countless other wonderful popular books and innumerable breakthrough scientific studies. Some of the other popular books include Human Anthropology and The Third Chimpanzee, also a much awarded book, and also Why is Sex Fun? And maybe we'll get into that as well. Jared Diamond is the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, countless research prizes from the American Physiological Society, National Geographic Society, the Zoological Society of San Diego, and many, many other awards and membership and honorary societies, including the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. He is also, with all of that, a practitioner of human ecology and sustainable development. His field studies in ecology have been focused, well, not focused, they're in many places of the world, but one area of tremendous focus is in Papua New Guinea, where he has been studying ecology and evolution of birds. His field work led to the rediscovery of New Guinea's long-lost golden-fronted bowerbird. He has many other field projects in other parts of the world, in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. That just about covers it. And he is working with major companies, oil companies and others in Papua New Guinea to find practical approaches for combining economic development and ecological sustainability. And that is absolutely at the heart of the mission of the Earth Institute as well, to find how to achieve not only sustainability, not only development, but truly sustainable development. So we're privileged today to have with us one of the world's leading thinkers and a great friend of the Earth Institute, Professor Jared Diamond.
Thank you. Let me first check whether you'll be able to hear me okay in back. It's a great privilege for me to be here at the invitation of an institution and a person whom I admire greatly, at the invitation of the Earth Institute and of Jeffrey Sachs. It's a real pleasure to be here. It would be a pleasure to be in New York on any basis. You'll be able to figure out from my accent that I was not born in New York. I was instead born in Boston, and I grew up in Boston. But my parents were both born and grew up in New York. My mother graduated Hunter College in 1927. I had two uncles who were superintendents, principals in the New York public school system. Then my sister, for her first job, worked at the New Yorker magazine for quite a few years, and so I visited Susan in New York. At the same time, I also spent years working in the American Museum of Natural History in the bird department on New Guinea birds. Since then, since Susan moved to Los Angeles, my visits to New York, my wife's and my visits have been less frequent, and therefore some of the reasons that induce you to live here, namely the opera, the restaurants, the cultural opportunities. It's very nice to be here on this occasion, however briefly. This evening, I wanted to talk about what might seem a depressing theme, namely collapses of societies, but collapses are the flip side of an encouraging theme, namely the successes of societies. People often ask, why on earth did you write a book on this subject of collapse? And the answer is simple. It's because it was the most fascinating, important, and central subject I could think of to write about. For me, it started out as the appeal of a romantic mystery when I was in my teens and 20s. My guess is that many of you, too, in your teens and 20s, were attracted by the romantic mystery of societies in the past that have collapsed, leaving behind monuments such as abandoned cities and temples and pyramids, often in areas where nobody is trying to make a living today, in deserts or in jungles. And you probably asked yourself, why on earth did people build cities and temples in these remote places, and why, having gone to the effort of doing so, did they then abandon their cities and pyramids? For example, the statue-building society of Easter Island, famous for its gigantic statues, which I'll tell you more about, but a society that eventually tore down and broke all of its statues. Or another Pacific Island society, Pitcairn Island, famous as the island to which the mutineers from the British ship HMS Bounty fled in 1790 to escape the long, vengeful arm of the Admiralty. The Bounty mutineers wanted a really remote, uninhabited island, and with Pitcairn they found it. But as soon as they scrambled up to the top of Pitcairn, they would have seen there the platforms and temples and statues of a Polynesian society that had previously settled Pitcairn and ended up all dead or abandoning the island. What happened to those first Pitcairn Islanders? Coming closer to home for us Americans, there's the most advanced society of Native Americans in the New World before Columbus, the Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, who built wonderful cities with temples. They had writing, they had astronomical observatories. The gorgeous cities now have become tourist destinations because many of them are surrounded by jungle where few people are trying to live today. Yet the Maya prospered there, and then sometime starting around the year roughly AD 800, in the classic Maya lowlands, the Maya gradually abandoned the cities into which they had put such effort. Why? Why did they collapse? Or even closer to home for us Americans, In the Four Corners area of the U.S. Southwest, where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet, thrived the most complex society in North America before Columbus, the Anasazi, who, starting around AD 700, developed an agricultural society in desert areas where nobody farms today. They built towns and they began to erect higher and higher buildings. Those were the highest skyscrapers in the United States before the skyscrapers that went up with steel girders and reinforced concrete in the Loop of Chicago in the 1870s. The Anasazi skyscrapers went up to 6 stories, but construction ceased in the year AD 1118. We know exactly from tree ring dendrochronology. And over the following decades, the Anasazi abandoned the towns and skyscrapers into which they had put such effort. Why? At this point, you may be starting to suspect that collapse is something that happens only to remote exotic people like Polynesians. So a counterexample is what happened to Norwegian Vikings who in the year AD 984 settled the world's largest island, Greenland, where these Norwegians developed the most remote outpost of Christian Europe, a society based on herding with a wonderful stone cathedral at Gardar, whose foundations are still there, and a dozen stone churches. The Norwegians in Greenland carried on for nearly 500 years. So we shouldn't write them off as a failure because they thrived for longer than has European society in North America now. But eventually, sometime around the year 1440, they ended up all dead, thereby demonstrating that collapse is something that happens not just to Polynesians, but it's also a risk for blue-eyed, blonde-haired European Christians literate in Latin and in runes. I still have the sketch that I prepared of my book, Collapse. It was on my yellow paper, this sort of paper, and the sketch was going to be of 18 chapters on 18 societies that collapsed. I showed my sketch to my editor, my wife Marie, for her opinion, and Marie's reaction was quick. She said, "Jared, for heaven's sakes, what are you thinking of? A book of 18 chapters on 18 failures? How depressing, how boring. Who on earth is going to want to read that? For heaven's sakes, lighten up." And I realized that not only would a book of 18 chapters on 18 failures be depressing and boring, but it would leave unanswered the main question in this area, which is, it's not the case that all societies in the past have been doomed to collapse. In many parts of the world, societies have been going on for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years without any sign of collapse. So why is it that some societies have succeeded in solving the problems that did in the Easter Islanders and the Maya and many of the other most advanced societies of their times? Hence, my book also considered some of the heartwarming success stories, and you won't find it depressing. There's Iceland, another group of Norwegian Vikings who settled Iceland in the year AD 871, where they encountered the most difficult environment in Europe. And so for a long time, Iceland was the poorest country in Europe, but the Icelanders eventually mastered their environmental and other problems so well that on a per capita basis, Iceland today is something like the 7th richest country in the world. And Iceland has been going strong now for 1,136 years. There's a real success story. Or a longer success story is Japan, where there have been complex societies for about 14,000 years, and again, no sign of collapse except for the military defeat of World War II. Why did the Japanese succeed in solving their problems so well? Or an even longer track record of success is in the New Guinea Highlands, where I do my field work, where people have been living for 46,000 years without any sign of collapse, and where, in fact, about 1,200 years ago, they managed to solve problems of renewable forestry that defeated the Maya and the Easter Islanders and many other people. At the same time, it's not enough to look at successes and failures in the past, because today, modern societies are facing all the problems that these past societies faced. Today we're still facing problems of water and topsoil and fish and wood. Plus today we're facing new problems, such as problems of energy and toxic chemicals. So is there something that we can learn from the past that could help us become one of the success stories rather than one of the failures? I began my book, in fact, with the American state of Montana, and one might wonder, in fact, the first readers of my book wondered, what on earth is a book entitled Collapse doing, beginning with the most beautiful, pristine, underpopulated, forest-covered state of the richest country in the world? Montana is at no risk of collapse. Any of you, though, who've been to Montana, or in fact anywhere in the intermontane West, know that when you scratch the surface of this beautiful underpopulated state, you find the problems besetting the rest of the world. Montana has the worst problems of toxic wastes in the United States. It has big problems of soil erosion and salinization, big problems of water, even problems of air quality. Missoula, Montana, near which my wife and kids and I spend parts of our summers, often has air quality worse than my own city, Los Angeles. And then as for climate change, Montana's outstanding tourist attraction is Glacier National Park, which is misnamed. When first seen by Europeans in the 1800s, the area of Glacier National Park had about 150 glaciers. Now they're down to about 14 glaciers, and if you want to see them, you better hurry, because at the rate that global warming is going now, it's expected that the glaciers of Glacier National Park will have melted by about 13 years from now, 2020. So that's Montana. Then, in the modern world, there's the African country of Rwanda, which carried out the worst nightmares of the British demographer Thomas Malthus, who warned us that human population problems will get solved one way or another, either in pleasant ways of our choice or in unpleasant ways that we don't choose. In Rwanda, the most densely populated country of Africa, with some of the most serious problems of deforestation and soil erosion in Africa, population built up throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. At the same time, farms were shrinking and the forests were being knocked down. And finally, in 1994, Rwandans transiently solved, if I can use that word, their population problems in a grisly way, when 6 million Rwandans, mostly with machetes, killed nearly 1 million Rwandans and drove another 2 million into exile. Coming closer to home for us Americans, there's the island of Hispaniola, about 100 miles off Florida. Hispaniola is as close as one gets in history to a controlled experiment. In chemistry or in molecular biology, one learns things through manipulative experiments with controls. For example, a chemist trying to understand the effect of some particular compound would take 2 test tubes with identical solutions and add one compound to one of those tubes and maintain the other tube as a control. In history, we can't do those neat controlled experiments, but sometimes history carries out natural experiments for us. One such natural experiment has taken place on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, which through accidents of history got divided between 2 countries, Haiti in the west, the Dominican Republic in the east, which have had quite different trajectories with different consequences today. Haiti in the west, on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, is the poorest country of the New World and one of the poorest countries in the world, more than 99% deforested, massive soil erosion, a government in a virtual state of collapse, unable to provide basic services such as water and electricity and sewage and education to many of its citizens. And then the eastern half of the same island is the Dominican Republic, which, granted, is still a developing country, but on a per capita basis, the DR is about 6 times richer than Haiti, about 1/3 covered with forests, with the most comprehensive national park system of the New World, considerably lower population density than Haiti. The DR is the world's 3rd leading exporter of avocados, and all of you who, like myself, grew up in Boston and are Boston Red Sox fans and admire the great Pedro Martinez will know that the DR is the world's leading exporter of great baseball players. Any of you who've taken the plane flight from Miami to Santo Domingo will have flown over the border between Haiti and the DR. The island looks as if it was cut by a knife with a straight line. And as you look this way, it's brown, and as you look this way, it's green. And if you actually stand on that border and you look this way, you see the muddy, treeless brown fields of Haiti, and then you turn around and 30 yards from you start the green pine forests of the Dominican Republic. Different choices, different histories, very different consequences of virtual controlled experiment. Then there's China, the most populous country in the world, with perhaps the most rapidly growing economy among major countries. China with so many people and such a big economy that China's environmental problems automatically become problems of the rest of the world, if only because China is putting out its wastes into the same oceans and the same atmosphere that bathe the rest of us, and also because China is now competing with the United States, Japan, Europe, and Australia for limited supplies of essential resources, notably oil, seafood, and metals. And then finally there's Australia, the first world country which rivals Iceland as being in the most fragile first world environment. But as a result, Australians today are the first world society considering the most radical solutions to their environmental problems. When I started out trying to understand success or failure of societies, I thought that I was going to look at human environmental impacts, and I eventually realized that it's more complex than that, of course. So eventually I arrived at a checklist of 5 factors that I go over now when trying to understand why any given society collapses or fails to collapse. In no particular order. One factor on that checklist is the one that I first had in mind, namely human environmental impacts. All societies require some natural resources: water, topsoil, wood, fish, etc. And it's difficult to manage natural resources, so societies often inadvertently overexploit the resources on which they depend and may thereby drive themselves to collapse by overexploiting essential resources and committing ecological suicide. So human environmental impacts are one factor on my checklist. Second factor is climate change, an expression today that we associate with global warming caused by humans. But in the past, the climate has always been changing, getting colder, warmer, drier, wetter. And those climate changes are variously better or worse for humans and interact with the effects of human environmental impacts, so that people that are hammering away at their environment may get away with it as long as the climate is in their favor. And then when the climate gets cold or dry or too wet or too hot, the combination of climate change and human environmental impacts pushes a society over the brink, as happened to the Anasazi and the Maya. Then a third item on my checklist is enemies. Most societies are not isolated, but they have neighbors with some of which they're intermittently at war or on hostile terms. And naturally, when a society gets weakened for any reason, for example, for its own internal economic problems or political problems, that's the time when the hostile neighbors take advantage of the weakened society and walk in on it and conquer it, making it regularly difficult for historians to decide whether the collapse of some past society was because of military conquest or whether the real reason was underlying internal problems of the society. The most familiar example of that debate concerns the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We all know that Rome fell somewhat arbitrarily in around the year AD 476, when the last Roman emperor was deposed by a Germanic barbarian chief. But we also know that Rome had been fighting very successfully against the barbarians for centuries and beating them and keeping them away from Rome's borders. So why is it that the barbarians eventually won after Rome had been winning for centuries? Was the real cause of the fall of the Roman Empire those barbarians, perhaps because the barbarians got more numerous or better armed or better organized, or was instead the real cause of Rome's fall, Rome's internal economic, political, social problems. And the barbarians, the same old barbarians, were always there at the borders, and they just took advantage of Rome's weakness to conquer Rome. But in that case, one would have to say that the fundamental cause of Rome's fall was not the enemies, but was internal problems. That debate still goes on among historians. Then a fourth item on my checklist is friends. Most societies are not self-sufficient, but depend on friendly trade partners for some essential imports, just as the United States today imports a substantial fraction of our oil, and we also import metals and other products. That means that a society that is managing its own internal problems perfectly well may be threatened if it depends for essential imports on friendly trade partners that have their own problems, and so the imports cease. That's a risk familiar to us Americans, or at least to anyone here old enough to remember the 1973-74 Gulf oil crisis, when the American economy was threatened not because of messes we were making at home, but because of issues and problems with our trade partners supplying us with much of our petroleum. And then finally, the fifth and last factor on my checklist to understand collapses or successes is a society's institutions, its economic, cultural, social, political institutions that result in the society either perceiving and solving or ignoring or failing to solve those first four sets of problems. All of this may seem abstract, so let me now give you a concrete example of a society that collapsed, and it's one of the most instructive cases. The collapse of the Polynesian society on Easter Island. Easter, the most remote habitable scrap of land in the world, an island of 60 square miles, 2,300 miles west of the coast of Chile, and 1,400 miles east of the nearest inhabited Polynesian island. Famous for the gigantic stone statues weighing up to 90 tons and up to 33 feet tall, erected by Polynesians with just stone tools, no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheels, and yet they managed to carve and transport these statues up to 12 miles and tip them into an upright position. Ask yourself, if you were given the task of transporting a 90-ton statue 12 miles and tipping it upright, and you had no wheels or metal tools or draft animals, think how you would do it. It's been a long-standing mystery how the islanders transported their statues, and then why, after erecting hundreds of them, their society collapsed and they pulled down and broke all of those statues. The mystery was acute, obvious already to the first European who, quotes, discovered Easter Island, meaning he found an island teeming with Polynesians, the Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen, who in 1722 came to Easter Island, saw the statues, and was struck by not only the statues, but also by the fact that Easter was the most barren island of the tropical Pacific. There were no trees on the island. And yet Roggeveen reasoned perfectly correctly that whatever those islanders had done to transport and erect 90-ton statues, they would have needed trees to get the wood with which to make levers or rollers or sleds to transport the statues, and also trees from whose bark to make the rope with which to pull the statues on the rollers or whatever they were pulled on. And yet here was an island without any trees. So Roggeveen concluded perfectly correctly that there was no way that the islanders could have erected and transported their statues given how Easter Island looked in 1722. That was mysterious, in fact so mysterious that the Swiss novelist Erich von Däniken postulated that the statues of Easter Island, since they couldn't have been erected by the islanders given how the island looked in 1722, the statues were instead, he suggested, erected by some super intelligent beings from outer space with highly evolved tools, beings who descended to Earth and with their tools erected the statues and then floated off into space again. The real explanation for what happened on Easter Island has emerged from studies of archaeologists and paleobotanists in the last 20 years, and it's even more romantic and instructive than von Däniken's reconstruction. It turns out that when Easter was first settled by Polynesians about 1,000 years ago, the island was not the treeless wasteland that we see today, but it was instead covered with a lush subtropical forest of several dozen tree species, including the world's biggest palm tree. And the islanders began to chop down trees for the same reason that all of us chop down trees, namely to clear land for gardens and agriculture, and to have wood for construction and for heating and for cooking, and to have wood and make rope to transport and erect the statues, and also to carve dugout canoes with which to go out to sea on the open ocean and harpoon tuna and dolphins, because in the oldest archaeological layers on Easter Island, the main bones there, making clear what was the main source of meat for the first Easter Islanders, are bones of tuna and dolphins. The islanders continued to chop down trees until sometime around the year 1680, they chopped down the last tree on the island, at which point they could no longer transport or erect statues, but they had bigger problems. Without any trees, there was no longer a source of green fertilizer to fertilize the fields. Also, without a forest cover, the soil would have been subject to wind and water erosion, and Easter Island society collapsed in an epidemic of civil war as the 12 rival clans of Easter Island fought each other, too many people for a shrinking resource pie, and victorious clans would then pull down and break at the neck the statues of defeated clans. It went on until in 1844, the last of the hundreds of statues that the Easter Islanders, that their ancestors had erected at such effort, was torn down and broken. Any of you who've actually visited Easter Island will understand the sense of tragedy that you get going around this island with just hundreds of broken statues, broken by the descendants of the very people who erected them. Of all the collapses of past societies, I found that the collapse of Easter Island is the one that grabs people the most, because the metaphor is so clear. Easter Island, isolated in the Pacific Ocean, is a metaphor for planet Earth, isolated in space today. When the Easter Islanders messed up their own island and were out of canoes, there was no other island to which they could flee, no other people whom they could summon for help. In the same way that if we on planet Earth today mess up our own island planet, there's no other planet or galaxy to which we'll be able to flee, and no other green extraterrestrials whom we'll be able to summon for help. When I've talked to my undergraduate geography students at UCLA about fates of societies, including the collapse of Easter Island, my UCLA students recognized a question whose significance had until then escaped me. My UCLA students asked me, why on earth do people do such dumb things as chop down all the trees on their island when they're a wood-dependent society? How could they be so blind? Well, just to place it in perspective, if there's still complex societies on Earth 100 years from now, you can bet that people in the future will look back at what we are doing in the year 2007 and ask how on earth could we have been so dumb to do the things that we're doing today. But my UCLA students asked, what do you think the person who chopped down the last tree on Easter Island said as he or she was chopping down that tree? My UCLA students offered suggestions. One student said, probably the person who chopped down that last tree shouted out, "Never fear, technology will solve our problems by discovering a substitute for wood." And another student said, no, probably the person who chopped down that last tree was a political conservative who shouted out, "This land is mine, this tree is mine, and I can do with it what I want, respect my private property rights, and keep the big government of the chiefs off my back." And still another student said, perhaps the person who chopped down that last tree was a logger who would have shouted out, "I am just so sick and tired of you tree-hugging, lily-livered, greeny environmentalists who care more for these lousy trees than you do care for the jobs of us loggers and for the livelihood of my children. Your fears are exaggerated, as always. I'm sure that there are plenty of trees left over there in the next valley. A ban on logging would be premature, and what we instead need is more research. Those were the suggestions of my UCLA students. The case of Easter Island, though, and any of these other collapses, illustrates that there are obvious lessons, and also some less obvious lessons, in these fates of past societies. Perhaps the most transparent lesson we can get from these collapses in the past is to take environmental problems seriously. Environmental problems contributed to dragging down many of the most advanced societies in the past. You'd better believe that they can, and they're in the process of dragging down many societies today. And yet, when one talks about the risks of environmental problems, now one is often greeted by a dismissive one-liner which says, but, you have to balance the environment against the economy. So, balance the environment against the economy. The tacit assumption of this one-liner is that taking care of the environment is a drain on the economy. The net effect is to cost money. Environmental safeguards are a luxury that we can afford only when we've got our economy in good shape. In fact, that one-liner, balance the environment against the economy, has it exactly reversed or upside down. The strongest reason for taking good care of the environment is economic reasons. Namely, environmental problems become so horribly expensive and may even become insoluble if you wait till a late stage, whereas if you catch environmental problems at an early stage, they're cheaper and much more feasible to solve. So that strong reasons for taking environmental problems seriously are economic reasons. This is a lesson that was rubbed into the faces of us Americans something like, 2 years ago, August, when, because for 10 years, various governmental agencies had considered it too expensive to invest a few $100 million into fixing up the dikes around one of our major cities, we instead found ourselves, after Hurricane Katrina, faced with a repair bill not of several $100 million, but several $100 billion. The costs of insurance and the cost of rebuilding one of our major cities, not to mention a few thousand dead Americans, all because we balanced the environment against the economy and didn't want to fix up the dikes when it would have been relatively cheap and easier to do so. That then is a simple, a transparent lesson that we can learn from the fates of past societies, namely to take environmental problems seriously. But there are deeper lessons, and one of those deeper lessons is one that I appreciated only in the late stages of work on my book. I was continually asking myself, why did some societies solve problems that destroyed other societies? Why did the leaders of some societies make good decisions and not in other cases? And it eventually struck me that I think a distinction between societies that succeed or fail to solve their problems, on the average, has to do with the role of the elite, the politicians, the wealthy people in a society whose decision makers, whose wealthy people are able to insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions for the broader society. Such a society has a recipe for disaster because the elite are likely to make decisions in their own short-term interests, but disastrous in the long run for society as a whole, because the politicians are not in the short run feeling the consequences of their actions. Whereas a society whose decision makers cannot insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions have leaders motivated to solve society's problems because they are affected by them. As an example, one might wonder, why on earth did the Maya kings not just look out the windows of their palaces around the year AD 800 and see the deforestation on the hillsides and the soil erosion on the hillsides, removing agricultural land and soil piling up in the valley bottoms? Why didn't the Maya kings just say, stop it, and halt the deforestation and soil erosion in time? The Maya kings may not have been motivated to solve those environmental problems of Maya society because the Maya kings had succeeded in their palaces in insulating themselves from the consequences of their actions. Namely, the kings were continuing to eat well from food brought to them as tribute by the commoners, and the kings were still building palaces and erecting monuments with the labor of the commoners, even while the commoners themselves were getting malnourished and eventually starving, until it was too late, and the commoners rose in revolt and overthrew the kings and burned their palaces. So the kings had insulated themselves in the short run from broader problems of Maya society, but not in the long run. The opposite example of a society whose politicians cannot insulate themselves from the broader problems of society is the Netherlands, Holland. I had never understood why it is that the Dutch are the people of whom the largest fraction belong to environmental organizations like World Wildlife or Conservation International. More than half of all Dutch belong to environmental organizations. And I didn't understand why until my 1997 trip to the Netherlands, when I was driving around with Dutch friends, Dutch bird-watching friends, in the Dutch countryside, and we were watching birds and chatting while going, and eventually I asked my Dutch bird-watching friends, why is it that you Dutch take environmental problems seriously and so many of you belong to environmental organizations? Their answer was unforgettable to me. They said, Jared, look at this land that we're driving through. It's flat, and you see those dikes there. This flat land, it's what we call a polder, P-O-L-D-E-R. It used to be a shallow bay of the sea. This land here is 23 feet below sea level. But it used to be a shallow bay around which the Dutch erected dikes, and then they pumped out the bay to gain more agricultural land in this country that's short of land, pumped out the water with windmills and now with power. And in that way, 1/3 of the present land area of the Netherlands is these polders, these drain bays that are below sea level, up to 23 feet below sea level. Water continues to leak in through the dikes, and we continue to pump it out with a carefully managed system of pumps and well-maintained dikes. But look on tops of the dikes. You don't see any mansions on tops of the dikes. In the Netherlands, everybody, rich and poor, politicians and voters, lives down below in the polders, and there's nobody safe up there on the dikes. So our politicians know perfectly well that if they did not take our water problems seriously and the dikes failed, they would drown along with everybody else. For any of you old enough to remember 1953, February 1, 1953, that was the day on which a combination of high tides and a storm in the North Sea broke the dikes protecting the Dutch province of Zeeland, and the floodwaters swept up to 100 miles inland. Thousands of Dutch, rich people, poor people, politicians, commoners drowned, and the politicians of this country with a population then of just 10 million, the politicians swore never again. They invested massively, something like $6 billion, into reinforcing, making super strong the dikes and the seawalls. And they were motivated to do so because the politicians had had the lesson rubbed into their face that if they didn't manage the environment of the Netherlands well, there was no way that they could insulate themselves from society's problems. And they had drowned along with everybody else. This problem of the role of the elite, the insulation of the elite, is one that concerns me increasingly in the United States today. As I look at social trends in the U.S. in the last 15 years, it seems to me that the wealthier people, the politicians in the United States, have succeeded increasingly in insulating themselves from the broader problems of American society, and as a result are separated from the consequences and less motivated to solve society's problems. Living in Los Angeles since 1966, I've now seen twice that it's not possible for the elite to insulate themselves from the broader problems of society. And yet, in Los Angeles, in the last 15 years, we've had the proliferation of a phenomenon called the gated community. I don't know if there are gated communities around New York, but in the LA area, we have a profusion of these communities which are literally surrounded by walls and gates in which wealthy people live, and within the gated communities, wealthy Los Angelinos are able in the short run to insulate themselves from the famous problems of LA and American society. Within the gated community, they're separated from the problems of the understaffed LA police force because they've got private security guards. Within the gated community, they're separated from the problems of the municipal water supply of LA, a big city in a desert, because they're drinking bottled water. They're also separated from the famous problems of the Los Angeles public school system because the kids from the gated communities go preferentially to private schools. And they're also separated from the national problems of our underfunded Social Security system and our non-existent national health system in the United States, national health insurance in the United States, because again, within the gated community, most people have private health insurance and private pensions. But as the Maya warned us, you can insulate yourself from society's problems for only so long. And in my 41 years in Los Angeles, twice I've seen the gates nearly breaking down, namely 2 major riots in LA that began in the poorer areas, the Watts riots and the Rodney King riots. In both cases, the rioters burnt and carried out widespread destruction in the poorer areas, and there was concern in the richer areas that the rioters would spill over into Beverly Hills and the other wealthy parts of LA. My wife and I remember very well the more recent riots, the Rodney King riots, because when those riots broke out, we were in Chicago. Our 5-year-old twin sons were in LA with a babysitter. We knew that they were going to school and being brought home from school. And we happened to turn on the television, and we were shocked to say to each other, our city is burning. We saw the riots in LA and the rioters. We didn't know where our kids were. Eventually, we found out that the babysitter, yes, did bring our kids home. On that occasion, the rioters did not spill over into the rich areas. What the police did to protect Beverly Hills was to string up strips of yellow plastic police tape across the entrances to the roads of Beverly Hills to keep out the rioters. Well, you know perfectly well that if the rioters had spilled out that far, the plastic police tape would have done no good. If things carry on as they are now in Los Angeles, there will eventually be more riots, and sooner or later, yellow plastic police tape is not going to suffice to insulate wealthy Los Angelinos from the broader problems of Southern California and American society. The United States as a whole seems to me, or the first world, the United States and Europe and Japan, are trying to behave like a gated community towards the rest of the world, namely enjoying a living standard, consumption rates on the average 32 times consumption rates in the third world, and hoping that they can continue to live, we can continue to live in a gated community and not be affected by what's going on out there in the third world. But September 11, 2001 and other things warn us that the first world is no longer going to be able, in the long run, to carry on as a gated community, immune from the problems affecting the rest of the world. Finally, whenever one tries, as I have, to draw lessons from history that could help us in dealing with problems we face today, if we would like our modern society to solve problems as did successful past societies and not to fall into the errors that drag down other past societies, you have to be aware of differences between the past and present. It's not straightforward to extrapolate lessons from the past to the present because one could say, today we got a whole new ball game. The present is unlike the past. There are big differences. And it's true, you can't just straightforwardly reason from the past to the present without taking account of the differences between the past and present. Some of those differences between past societies and present societies are ones that make our current situation much more dangerous than in the past and would incline us towards pessimism or even fatalism. For example, one difference between the past and present, or a pair of differences, is that today we have far more people packing far more potent destructive technology than at any time in the past. Easter Island had about 10,000 people with stone tools on an island of 60 square miles, and it took them about 800 years to chop down every tree on their island. Today, we have not 10,000 people, but 6.5 billion, and we've got not stone tools, but metal tools, bulldozers, chainsaws, nuclear power, and as a result, we're deforesting the whole Earth much faster than the Easter Islanders deforested their little 60 square mile island. That difference, more people, more potent destructive technology, makes our present situation much more dangerous than at any time in the past. Another difference between the past and present is captured by that familiar term, globalization, which to us in the first world, we often interpret to mean we here in the first world, sending them out there in the third world, our good stuff like Coca-Cola and email messages. But globalization just means improved communications, faster communications this way and that way, and not just good things, but also bad things moving back and forth. And so globalization also means not just that we send them Coca-Cola, but they can send us things, some of which we don't want, including terrorists and unstoppable waves of immigration and emerging diseases. The consequences of globalization are that today it's difficult for a society to collapse in isolation. In the past, when Easter Island collapsed, nobody else in the world knew about it, nobody was affected by it. But today, when any remote society collapses, it may have consequences for the rest of the world, and in fact, American troops may go in. When in the last 15 years, among the countries that have gotten into trouble or even collapsed are really remote, poor countries like Somalia, or landlocked Afghanistan, or Iraq, which is poor except for its oil. And nevertheless, globalization has meant that the United States has found it necessary to send troops even to such remote, poor countries, illustrating that today the risk we face is not of isolated Easter Island-like collapses, individual societies winking out one by one, but instead the risk of a global collapse. If those two differences were the main differences between past and present, at this point, I would be really pessimistic and desperate, and I would invite you all to join me outside for a Jamestown-like mass suicide, because it would really be hopeless. But instead, there are two other differences between the past and present that give us an advantage and make me cautiously optimistic. One of those differences is again related to globalization, namely mass communications. Today we have newspapers, radio, and television. And so in the morning you turn on your television set and you see what is happening today anywhere around the world. You see what's happening this morning in Haiti and Iraq, and you can choose to learn from these disaster areas of the modern world. And you can also see in your television what's happening today in Norway or Iceland, and we can choose to emulate these success stories. So we have the opportunity to learn from societies remote from us in space. We are the first society in world history with this advantage. In contrast, when the Easter Islanders were debating whether or not to chop down the last trees in 1680, they had no television sets to teach them that then in 1680, the Haitians were just getting embarked on their disastrous course of deforestation, while the Japanese under the Tokugawa shogun were embarking on a program of reforestation that would make Japan self-sufficient in wood. The Easter Islanders didn't have that opportunity to learn from societies remote from them in space. And our other great advantage is that we are the first society in world history with the opportunity to learn from societies remote from us in time. We have archaeologists and historians, and so we know what happened to all these past societies. We can choose to emulate the examples of the past success stories, and we can choose to avoid the examples of past disasters. We have that opportunity. We are the first society in world history with that opportunity. But again, the Easter Islanders, as they were debating whether to chop down those last trees in 1680, the Easter Islanders had no archaeologists or historians. So they had no way of knowing that the experiment had already been done different ways with different outcomes. The Easter Islanders couldn't know that 800 years previously, New Guinea Highlanders had encountered a crisis of deforestation like the one facing Easter in 1680, but the New Guinea Highlanders figured out how to transplant casuarina trees into their villages, and so the New Guinea Highlanders carried on and became self-sufficient in wood. While also 800 years previously, the Maya, facing the same questions about whether to chop down trees, the Maya had made the opposite decision, carried on chopping down their trees with disastrous consequences. So we are then the first society in world history with these opportunities to learn from societies remote from us in space and in time. That's what makes us cautiously optimistic. We have the choice. My hope is that we will exercise this choice, learn from past societies, and so end up in a world like Norway or Iceland rather than a world like Haiti or Easter Island. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and insightful lecture. We have time for question and answer until half past the hour, and then a reception and a book signing to which everybody is welcome through the doors on my left to your right. Thank you for so many insights. Let me, if I could, just make a couple of observations, and while I do, those who want to ask questions, please go to the microphones. And these are for questions, not for speeches. Also, please, when you do ask the question, identify yourself first to give your name and where you are affiliated with our community. But if I could just myself make a couple of points about your wonderful lecture. Your observation about the gated community reminded me of the wonderfully wise words of John Kennedy's inaugural address when he said famously that if, and I quote, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And what you've done is offer a very important model of why that is, beyond the obvious one of simply the widening pressures and gaps of rich and poor, but the destruction of the signals to the rich about what's happening in the common environment. And I think that that's an extremely important message, and it does suggest that we ought to move the capital to the lower ninth of New Orleans, both to get it built and then to take care of the risks of climate change afterwards. And the second thing that I wanted to commend to all of us in our community is the wisdom of the checklist that you proposed. I've, in a different context, called it a differential diagnosis, but the key point is that there is no one factor to complex phenomena. There are many, and it's absolutely crucial to be systematic about the physical and the social, the ecological, the political, and understand that in a complex set of systemic changes and interlinkages that one needs that kind of differential diagnosis. At least 5 points on the checklist that Jared Diamond mentioned, and many within each of those categories. Let me now invite people from our community to ask questions and ask Jared Diamond to come back up and take the questions. And I will sit back down and we'll continue until half past, and then the book signing and reception out in the faculty room to your right. Please. And then I'll let you
yes.
Jared afterwards. Just point back and forth.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Joe Whitty, a meteorologist. This begs the question, what are your views on the challenges we face with global warming then?
What are my views on the challenges we face with global warming? I see it as one of the dozen major problems that we face today. There are some people who would say it's the most important problem we face today. No, I would not say that. Global warming can do us in, but even if we solve global warming, there are other problems such as water and toxic chemicals and topsoil that could do us in. But yes, global warming is a major problem, and we've got to get it right or we are in deep trouble. If the world 50 years from now is 5 degrees on the average warmer than it is now, there will be big trouble. But global warming is a problem that we're capable of solving now.
Hi, Stans Nelson, undergraduate student. As you say, there is hope, in light of our environmental problems. But do you think that, in addition to trying to avoid some sort of global collapse, we should also be considering what happens and what we should do if things don't turn out so well? If we have, for example, at least a partial collapse. When the Roman Empire fell, everyone didn't die. What happens to them? And if so, do you think we can use lessons from past societies have collapsed, like you observe in your book? Thank you.
Should we not only try to ensure a good outcome, but also prepare ourselves for a bad outcome? Personally, I would rather put more effort into ensuring a good outcome, but I am perfectly willing to speculate about what form a bad outcome could take. There are many possible forms, but one form in which humans were not wiped out completely would be an outcome in which first world society can no longer be sustained. If that were the case, it would be difficult to rebuild first world society because complex societies were built in the past when iron and copper and tin were readily available at the surface, but we've mined away the readily accessible minerals, we've removed the readily accessible oil, so if we destroyed first world society, it would be difficult to put it back together again. Who will survive in that case? I would bet on my friends in the New Guinea highlands, because until recently, some of my friends still made stone tools and know how to make stone tools and had a subsistence economy. I doubt that there's anyone in this audience here who, if there were a collapse of first world society, would be able to make a living with stone tools as can New Guineans. So my bet in the worst case scenario is New Guinea highlands.
Robert Klitzman from the Medical School and the School of Public Health. Thank you very much for your comments. I have just a question about one of your conclusions that seemed a source of optimism, which is in terms of how we're different from the past. It seems to me that since Gibbon's book, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and certainly since the Renaissance, when there was a sort of historical awareness of the fact that Rome had fallen and why, at least some reasons why, I'm struck that we hadn't learned from that. In other words, that what happened in Haiti still happened in Haiti, and there are probably other examples of collapses since, the 1400s or 1500. I'm wondering what may make us different than the fact that we hadn't learned from those historical examples before.
Mm-hmm. One might indeed say, if we haven't learned our lesson by now, what makes you think we are going to learn it now? Why might we learn the lesson now? One might hope we would learn it because we've got far more information from history and archaeology. We've got far more powerful social sciences. But there actually are, amidst all the depressing trends, some trends that make me hopeful. And among those trends that make me hopeful are the policies of some of the forces in first world society most hated by the general public, namely big businesses. About a month ago, I was astonished. I've dealt with Walmart in the last year and learned a lot about Walmart. Walmart is one of those subjects that, it's one of the few subjects that my wife and I cannot discuss calmly because my views about Walmart are more sympathetic than my wife's. But about a month ago, I was surprised to read in the newspaper that Walmart had announced that over the next about 4 years, they're going to phase out all their purchases of non-sustainably managed fisheries, and they're going to convert all their seafood purchases to sustainably managed fisheries. Now, I've been interested in the efforts of the Marine Stewardship Council for the last decade to switch fish purchases to sustainably managed fisheries. And I've been aware of efforts to convince governments to do something about it. But there is no more potent force that I could have imagined towards sane fishery practices than a decision on the part of Walmart to stop buying from the bad fisheries and to start buying from the good fisheries. That's Walmart. There have been similar encouraging decisions by Home Depot, leader of the timber industry, by Chevron and some other oil companies. So that's a big reason why, despite all the reasons to be pessimistic and despite our having muffed the opportunity to learn before now, I see some potent forces that seem to be learning.
Dr. Diamond, thank you for your insights. My name is Daniel Peterson. I'm an adjunct professor in transportation here. Following on the undergraduate's assertion that basically we will and run out of the natural resources that fuel our economy and that have developed the 6.5 billion people that we have today, what do you see once we no longer have carbon and nuclear fuel to be able to fuel this economy to be our carrying capacity on this planet? Will we be back to the 1 billion we were before the pre-industrial era? And if so, following on your other comment, will we be able to sustain these kinds of institutions?
Two good questions. What will be our carrying capacity, and will we be able to support an institution like this? On the second question, can we support Columbia University and First World Society on an economy that is consuming much less? Yes, I think we can. I came back from Europe a couple of weeks ago, and I frequently go to Europe. And so I've seen that in Europe, Europeans sustain a standard of living which, by most reasonable measures, health, art, leisure, pensions, etc., Europeans enjoy a standard of living at least as high as, and perhaps higher than that in the United States. And yet consumption rates in Europe are on the average about half those in the United States, and Europeans can still do a good deal to save to reduce their consumption. My German and Dutch friends, they recycle not into 3 bins as in Los Angeles or into 1 bin as in Montana, but they recycle into 6 bins, and they recycle so accurately that you don't need secondary checking, whereas in Los Angeles, when we recycle into 3 bins, the city still needs to hire people to check because Los Angelinos don't sort very accurately. Fuel consumption per capita in Europe is about half that in the United States, for all the obvious reasons: much more fuel-efficient cars, that there is not a reward for buying Humvees and huge SUVs, but there's a tax penalty for buying Humvees and SUVs. So that's why I think that it is will be possible to sustain UCLA and Columbia with lower consumption rates. As for the number of people, there's a lot of debate about the carrying capacity of Earth. What it usually comes down to is the carrying capacity depends upon the lifestyle at which we try to support that population. I would be cautiously optimistic that we can carry on with the population that we've got now, that we don't have to drop back to 500 million people, but we will certainly be in more trouble the more people we've got.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I'm a soon-to-be graduating nurse. When I ask this question, I have Iraq and Haiti in mind. While I was reading Collapse 2 years ago, I simultaneously was reading The Uses of Haiti so that I could get away from how depressing Collapse was, even though The Uses of Haiti was 10 times more collapse.
Can you speak up your heart?
Sorry. My question is, are you familiar with Paul Farmer's work, The Uses of Haiti, and do you buy into his argument about the singular ultimate causation being the unfriendly nature of the United States towards places like Haiti and Iraq?
I have not read his books, so I can't comment on it, but when I hear a summary that the singular cause is the problems of the United States, I disagree completely. The United States is only one of a number of the United States is doing some things very well, and we're doing some things badly. The United States has made big progress in dealing with air quality in the last 30, 40 years. That makes me hopeful that if we can make progress with air quality, we can make progress with other things. Japan, Europe, Australia are also part of the problem. So no, just as Jeffrey Sachs said, in effect, avoid single-factor explanations. Avoid single villain explanations. There are plenty of villains going around. Yeah.
Hi, Joshua Catcher, television producer. I have 2 premises from Derek Jensen's book Endgame that I'd be curious to hear your response to. They're 2 short premises. I'll just read them. Premise 1, civilization is not and can never be sustainable. This is especially true for industrial civilization. Premise 2, our way of living, industrial civilization, is based on, requires, and would collapse very quickly without persistent and widespread violence.
I disagree with both. As for industrial civilization, no, I don't see anything fatally flawed about industrial civilization. We're doing some things wrong, many things wrong. If we do those things right, I don't see any reason why we can't carry on indefinitely.
Hi, my name is Pedro Sanchez. I'm a soil scientist at the Earth Institute. Delighted about all what you have written about soils. But my question is totally different. My question is speculation. How far off was the world instead of Columbus, quote, discovering America, the Mayans would have, quote, discovered Europe?
That's a good example of it's a really interesting question, counterfactual history. Historians nowadays often ask these counterfactual questions. What would have happened if the Maya had discovered Europe? Or perhaps more promising case, what would have happened if the Aztec Emperor Montezuma had discovered Europe? Because the Aztecs had an empire. The Maya were not yet organized in an empire. The reason that the Aztecs did not discover Europe is that they didn't have big boats and the whole economic organization to support those boats. But if they had discovered Europe, the outcome would have been the same as it was now. Namely, the Aztecs were susceptible to smallpox, measles, TB, diphtheria, pertussis. There was no crowd epidemic disease in the New World to threaten Europeans. There were a dozen crowd epidemic diseases in the Old World. Eurasia was several thousand years ahead of the New World. That's to say, developments happened several thousand years earlier in Eurasia as regards metal technology, as regards writing, as regards the formation of empires and centralized state governments. So the head start of the Old World over the New World was just too large. As for the reasons why that head start, that was the subject of my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And basically, I see it as having nothing to do with the individual people, but everything to do with what geography and biogeography made available to people in certain areas of the Old World and New World, but there was a greater variety of domesticable wild plants, and especially animals, in the Old World and in the New World, plus the east-west axis of Eurasia. So if the Maya had discovered the Old World, the outcome would have been the same, in my opinion. Yes.
Diane Buxbaum, EPA, and the Sierra Club, two rather disparate groups. But anyway, first of all, thank you for costing me so much money for having to buy my family Guns, Germs, and Steel and Collapse, each member of my family. But anyway, beyond that, Dr. William Schlesinger is coming to speak at the Sierra Club in a month and a half. He's going to be talking about the relationship between population issues and the environmental, well, probably global warming and other environmental degradation. A statement in a recent editorial he had in the Duke University magazine said that no matter what we do to improve the quality of the environment, nothing will help if we do not learn to, in somehow manner, reduce the rate of population or actually stabilize the rate of population growth on the planet. And I'm just wondering if you have any solutions that you could offer.
I certainly do have a comment on that, on the issue of population. 30 or 40 years ago, people concerned with environmental population problems considered population as the single most important Trump problem. And now I would say we know that that's not the case. It's one of a dozen major problems, but it's unfair to say that it's the major problem. Reason why I say that is that number 32 that Jeff has spent a good deal of his time trying to understand. The factor of 32, the difference between average consumption rates in the first world and in the third world. What counts is not the number of people. If all these people were in cold storage or living as in the New Guinea Highlands, the world could support 10 billion New Guinea Highlanders. What counts is human consumption rates, which are the product of number of people times consumption rate per capita. But the average consumption rate in the first world is 32 times that in the third world. I'm not worried about the what is it, 40 million Kenyans whose population is increasing at 4% per year or whatever it is. That is a tragedy and difficulty for Kenya, but it's not a problem for the rest of the world. I'm much more concerned about the population growth rates in the first world of Americans, Europeans, and Japanese, because one American, Japanese, Australian, European equals in consumption rates 32 Kenyans and 32 Zambians. That's why I regard population as a issue, but not the Trump issue that it used to be considered.
Okay,
I'm afraid we've come to the end of the time for the scheduled questions, but Professor Diamond will be in the next room, and I want to invite everybody, before you move, first let's do it properly. I want to invite everybody to the faculty room afterwards for reception and book signing, and most importantly, let's give a very warm ovation to Professor Diamond.